Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to a new lesson on the American Civil War. Today we're going to look at how to answer an interpretation question. Speaking of which, I went through your mocks, and while I was impressed by the quality of some of your answers, I must also admit that many of you, did not achieve the grade that they deserved, even in questions that we tried again and again in the classroom, for a simple fact. You didn't mention any example. You kept it very generic and very vague. Sometimes, yes, that can save you from having 0 marks on a question, and you should totally do that. Answer a question, just write anything, as long as it's sort of in topic, and you will get 1 or 2 marks, and 1 or 2 marks per question are actually often more than enough to change your grade, to turn a 4 into a 5 and so on. But some of you were actually able to turn this very vague sort of answering ability into a form of art. And you know who you are, okay? Being able to write something generic yet correct and almost reaching a grade 4, I was sincerely impressed reading certain answers. I felt like I was watching Da Vinci painting the Mona Lisa. They really were masterpieces of student improvisation, so well done. But we can do better, because unfortunately, while this strategy will allow you to pick up points in questions about which you know nothing, it will not guarantee you a passing grade. To do that, you need to show that you know at least something about the topic. Bring up some facts, dates, names, really whatever comes to your mind. If, for example, you write social consequences are very important because society changed a lot, the examiner will smile, see right through your improvisation, and give you a 2 out of 8, or if he's in a good mood, a 3 out of 8. If you want a passing grade, and I think most of you do, you need examples, factual knowledge and contextual knowledge. Okay? Now that this is out of the way, this is exactly why today we're focusing on how to answer an interpretation question based on the sources themselves, but also on what we studied in the previous weeks. Tomorrow we'll try to answer another question: how were the lives of people in the South affected by the Civil War? And finally on Thursday we'll try and answer the very same question that you had in the mocks: what was the most important consequence of the Civil War? Unfortunately, due to the screening of Macbeth and the mock madness in the previous weeks, we won't really go through some detailed lesson on the Civil War itself, especially the one on how weapons improved, which was my favorite. But if you need to know about it, you can look it up in the notes, which are also attached to this classwork. So, how are we going to tackle this question? We're going to look first at the two interpretations and at how they say, what they say coincides with what we know about the historical period. Ready? Let's do some history. Now, let's start with interpretation A, which was written by Jefferson Davis, which you might remember as the first and only president of the Confederate States in 1880. When did the Civil War end? 1865. Now, what does Jefferson Davis have to say about the causes of the Civil War? Need to get my hat to get in the role, even though he probably didn't have a hat. Never mind. Now, the Confederates fought for the defense of a fundamental right to withdraw from a union in which they had, as an independent community, voluntarily entered. On reading what has recently been written, people might be led to the conclusion that the war was caused by efforts on the one side to extend and keep human slavery, and on the other to resist it and establish human liberty. The Southern states and Southern people have been represented as defenders of slavery, and the Northerns as the champion of universal freedom. This is a falsehood. Away with the Jefferson hat. Even though I don't know why I did this sort of more British accent. Never mind. Now, let's talk about interpretation A. Interpretation A comes from, as we said, a memoir. So a book of memories, an autobiography, if you will, even though they're not exactly the same, written by Jefferson Davis, the first and only president of the Confederate States from 1861 to 1865. Where's my pen now? Davis wrote that after the war was over, in order to justify his actions in the eye of the public, he wrote that the war was not about slavery. Okay, he wrote that 20 years after the war, and trying to justify oneself in front of the public opinion is generally a pretty common feature in documents written after a military or a political defeat. You're trying to say, I was not in the wrong, I was misunderstood. Okay? Think, for example, at all the German generals who accused Hitler of issuing incompetent military orders in the memoirs after World War II. Sure, Hitler was no military genius, but a deeper research showed that blaming it on the Führer was actually a common way of unloading the blame on someone who was already dead and hated by everyone. Okay, oh no, I didn't want to do that, Hitler told me to. And that many of the massacres and the military mistakes made by the German army were actually the fault of those very same generals, who, to pass the blame on to someone else, who was, again, already dead and hated rightfully by everyone, they said they blamed it on him. In this particular case, going back to the American Civil War, Davis' memoirs try to convince us that the South was not fighting to preserve slavery, which was fighting to preserve slavery was actually a morally despicable thing to do, especially after the South had lost the Civil War. But he wanted to say that the South was actually fighting an heroic battle to preserve its autonomy against the tyrannical federal government. How does this picture hold up? Now, if we look at the Declaration of Secession, the declarations by which the states of the Confederacy said, we are no longer part of the United States, we're off, we're leaving. Those are the declarations of secession, and they explain why they did that. So if we look at those declarations issued by the single states, I linked a source in the transcript, we can see that the sentences about slavery, or which include the word slave or institution or these sort of things, in most cases, with the exception of South Carolina, which is weird, constitute about half of the entire text of the declaration. Okay, half of what they said. We are leaving because slavery. Okay. States' rights, the thing Jefferson is talking about the right of the states to enter the Union and therefore to leave by their own accord. This is what Davis was meaning. They only constitute about 5 to 10% of the whole text of the several declarations issued by the slaves, whereas, as we said, by the states, whereas, as we said, slavery was 50% of the content. So from this, what can we say? That yes, as Davis said, the Confederate States did leave the Union voluntarily because they wanted to exercise the right they believed they had, okay, because they thought they were allowed to. But they did so in order to preserve the institution of slavery, and therefore the claim that the states did not leave because of slavery was, to use Jefferson Davis' own words, a falsehood. They did leave because of slavery. And how do we know? Because they told us, okay, not someone else after. They told us themselves. Now, let's move on to interpretation B. No hat this time. In 1860, there was a great excitement over the election of Mr. Abraham Lincoln as President of the United States. The slaves prayed to God for his success. We knew that he was in sympathy with the abolition of slavery. The election was the signal for a great conflict in which the question was, shall there be slavery or no slavery in the United States? The South said, yes, there shall be slavery. So this is another memoir titled 28 Years a Slave, and it was written 50 years after the event, around 1909, so 40-something years, closer to 50 than 40. Now, who was, I forgot his name, Thomas Johnson. Who was Thomas Johnson? He was a slave himself, okay? And, well, a slave who, after the war, was freed, so he went through the entire conflict as a slave, had his own personal life as a black slave who later was freed and later turned into a missionary. So this source offers us the point of view of a slave, of someone who was only in the position of receiving the news and reacting to the events. Okay, he was not there in the rooms where political decisions were made. And this, I mean, Davis was there. Davis was taking the decision. This slave was not. He was working as a slave. So he was not in a position to shape the event, just to react to them. While this might make it sound less authoritative, less convincing, this interpretation actually still offers us the point of view of the slaves, a point of view which is generally ignored, okay? And says that the slaves saw the election of Lincoln as a potential turning point for the issue of slavery. Okay, they clearly connect the issue of slavery and the fact that something was about to go down with the election of Abraham Lincoln. This is correct, unlike what Davis said. How do we know? We know that the election of Lincoln was run exactly on those premises of abolishing slavery or in some way trying to sort out the issue of slavery before something like a civil war happened. And a great example of this is the famous House Divided speech given in 1858. Lincoln had. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently, half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will all become all one thing or all the other. Lincoln had off. So what is he saying? A house divided against itself cannot stand. A government, a state, a country cannot be half slave and half free. Something needs to happen. Either all the country accepts slavery or all the country forbids it. And Lincoln was more inclined to this second idea, to forbid slavery in the Constitution. So in this speech, Lincoln clearly expressed, as we said, his intention to solve the issue once and for all. And this was something that the slaves might have actually been aware of. Yes, they were slaves, yes, they were isolated, but they might have heard their masters talking about it worriedly, having conversation. Oh, you know, Lincoln is going to be elected and he's going to make all these black people free and so on. I mean, yes, it is convincing. It makes sense. Makes sense based on the evidence we have, based on our knowledge, and our knowledge is based on certain sources. Yes, after checking it against our knowledge, I think we can safely say that interpretation B of the slaves rejoicing that Lincoln is going to be elected is much more convincing, despite the shortcomings of its nature as a source, which is its bias, pro-slave bias, and the fact that it was written 50 years after the event. Now, I mentioned bias, and every source has a bias, okay? Bias is not a negative thing. This is a very long discussion which we will not have now, but keep in mind that saying that a source is biased is saying absolutely nothing, because every single thing that we say, that we do, that we leave to posterity is in some shape or form biased, okay? Now that we've gathered some facts and some evidence, I think we should move on to a model answer. Bit of a side note, you know the Peel structure, point, evidence, explanation, and link. Personally, I tend to invert the position of the two E's. First, I give the explanation, and then I support the explanation with evidence. That's my thing, but you can do that, or you can follow the other model, your choice, as long as there is some evidence, and that evidence is explained or is used to support an explanation, it's fine. And all the parts are highlighted in different colors in the transcript, so to make them readable. So, model answer hat on. Yes, I like my hat. Now, I think interpretation B is more convincing, not because its evidence is particularly strong, but because the contents of interpretation A falls apart under closer scrutiny. Interpretation B gives us the point of view of a former slave, one who had first-hand experience of how certain people lived the outbreak of the Civil War. It was, for them, clearly a war done to deliver them from slavery, and they applauded the election of Lincoln, who ran his electoral campaign of 1860 on an anti-slavery platform, or at least with the explicit intention of sorting out the division between slave states and free states once and for all, as shown in his House Divided speech. The interpretation is, nevertheless, not the work of someone who had any influence in the events, but merely of someone who was forced to live them. Why did I add this? Because the question is about the causes of the Civil War, so maybe it's something interesting to specify the role one of the authors of the sources might have had in shaping the events. This guy had no role in shaping the events. Interpretation A, on the other hand, is the product of Jefferson Davis, the first and only president of the Confederacy. This should give this interpretation more authority, but in reality it does the opposite. Davis was writing 20 years after the war and wanted to justify his actions to the rest of the country. The Confederate States left the Union exactly because they were afraid that the federal government wanted to make slavery legal on a national level, as shown by the Declaration of Secession issued by the very same Confederate States in 1861. Therefore, Davis' claim that the secession was not about slavery was, to use his own words, a falsehood, and interpretation A, which places more emphasis on the issue of slavery, is more convincing. Interpretation hat off. Now, those were the facts, those were the way you should answer a source question. So read the two interpretations and then check them against your own knowledge. If you have any knowledge at all about what's going on, maybe because we discussed it in class, maybe because you just know, use it. Okay? All source questions will require that. While you can get a 1 or 2 points by talking about just the source itself, if you want to do something more, and you should want to do something more, add some external knowledge, add what you know about those facts. That said, I'm looking forward to read your answers and see you next time.